The morning sun hadn't quite burned off the Atlanta humidity yet, but inside the courthouse the air was crisp, too crisp, like the building was trying to stay serious while the city outside buzzed with life. Courtroom 3B sat on the third floor, tucked between a quiet hallway and the echoing footsteps of lawyers, clerks, and curious onlookers. It wasn't the grandest courtroom in the building. No marble columns or stained glass windows, but it had a kind of quiet dignity, the kind that came from years of decisions made, arguments heard, and justice, however imperfect, attempted. At exactly 8:58 a.m., the bailiff, a retired police officer with silver at his temples and a voice that carried without shouting, stepped into the well of the courtroom. He adjusted his belt, cleared his throat, and waited. The room, already half full, began to hush. Lawyers straightened their ties. Reporters stopped scribbling. Even the guy who'd been nervously tapping his pen against his notepad for the last 10 minutes froze mid-tap. 2 minutes later, the side door near the bench opened. She walked in alone, no entourage, no dramatic pause, just steady steps in low-heeled shoes that clicked softly against the tile. Her black robe hung straight, not too loose, not too tight. Her hair was pulled back neatly, not hidden, just out of the way. She carried a leather portfolio under one arm, and a calm that seemed to settle over the room like a blanket. She didn't scan the crowd for reactions. She didn't need to. She knew who was there. She'd read the file. She'd studied the players. And she knew exactly what kind of day this might become. The bailiff's voice cut through the silence like a bell. All rise for the Honorable Judge Evelyn Carter. Chairs scraped. Jackets were smoothed. Nearly every person in the room stood, some out of habit, some out of respect, some just because they didn't want to stand out by staying seated. Everyone, that is, except one man. He sat in the front row of the plaintiff's side, legs crossed, arms folded over a tailored navy suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. He didn't even glance toward the bench. Instead, he stared straight ahead, jaw set, eyes narrowed like he was watching a movie he didn't care for. A faint smirk played at the corner of his mouth, the kind that said, "I'm above this." A few people noticed right away. The court reporter paused, her fingers hovering over the keys. The defense attorney, a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and sharper instincts, glanced sideways, then quickly looked back at her notes. But not before her eyebrows shot up. Someone in the back row whispered, "Is he serious?" The whisper didn't travel far, but it didn't need to. The tension was already spreading. The judge reached the bench. She placed her portfolio down gently, adjusted the microphone, and finally looked out over the room. Her gaze moved slowly, taking in faces, postures, the usual courtroom ballet of nerves and strategy. Then it landed on him. She didn't flinch, didn't frown, didn't sigh, but something shifted in the air, like the moment before a storm when the wind stops and everything goes still. She knew who he was. Everyone did. Damien Thorne, tech billionaire, self-made, frequently featured on magazine covers with headlines like Disruptor or The Man Who Rewrote the Rules. He'd built an empire, selling software that tracked everything, from your sleep patterns to your grocery habits, and he'd done it with a reputation for never backing down, never apologizing, and never, ever doing what someone told him to do just because they held a title. And now, here he was, refusing to stand for a judge, not just any judge, a black woman, the youngest ever appointed to this court. Someone whose name had been whispered in legal circles for years, not because she was loud, but because she was precise. Because she asked questions others avoided. Because she treated every case, whether it involved a parking ticket or a corporate merger, with the same level of care. She took her seat. The bailiff, sensing the shift, gave a small nod and said, "Be seated." The room sat again, everyone except Thorne, who finally uncrossed his legs and leaned back in his chair like he owned it, which, given his net worth, he probably felt he did. The judge opened her file, flipped a page, took a slow breath. Then she spoke, her voice clear but not loud, calm but not soft. "Mr. Thorne." He turned his head just enough to look at her but didn't rise. "Your Honor." "You are aware," she said, "that it is customary to stand when the presiding judge enters the courtroom." "I'm aware of a lot of customs," he replied, his tone casual, almost bored. "Some make sense. Some are just theater." A few people in the gallery shifted uncomfortably. One of the junior associates from his legal team, a young man who looked like he hadn't slept in 2 days, closed his eyes briefly, as if praying for the floor to swallow him. The judge didn't react. She simply looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she said, "This courtroom is not a stage. It is a place where the law is applied equally, regardless of wealth, status, or personal opinion. Standing is not about me. It's about the institution you are standing in." Thorne shrugged slightly. "Institutions change. I prefer to stand for actions, not symbols." There it was. The line. The unspoken thing hanging in the air since the moment he walked in. It wasn't really about courtroom etiquette. It was about who he believed deserved his respect and who didn't. But the judge didn't take the bait. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't scold. Instead, she turned to the clerk. "Let the record reflect that Mr. Thorne remained seated during the entrance of the court." Then, without missing a beat, she said, "We'll begin with the motion to dismiss in the matter of Thorne Industries versus Metro Data Systems." His legal team sprang into action, shuffling papers, whispering to each other. Thorne finally sat up straighter, but still didn't apologize, still didn't acknowledge the moment that had just passed. To him, it was probably just another Tuesday, another room full of people waiting for his permission to matter. But the people in that courtroom knew better, because what they just witnessed wasn't just rudeness. It was a test. And everyone, lawyers, clerks, reporters, even the security guard by the door, was waiting to see how the judge would respond. She didn't rush. She let the attorneys argue their points. She asked sharp, specific questions. She referenced case law from memory. She treated the opposing counsel with the same patience she gave Thorne's overpaid team. And all the while, Thorne watched her, not with admiration, but with a kind of wary curiosity, like he was trying to figure out if she was playing a longer game than he expected. At one point, during a lull in the arguments, he caught her eye again. This time, she held his gaze just a second longer than necessary. Not challengingly, not angrily, just steadily, as if to say, "I see you, and I'm not afraid of what you think you can do here." Outside, the city kept moving. Cars honked. Tourists took photos of the courthouse steps. But inside courtroom 3B, time seemed to slow. Every word carried weight. Every silence spoke volumes. By the time the first break was called, the energy in the room had changed completely. What had started as a routine civil hearing now felt like something much bigger, like the kind of moment people would talk about years later, not because of the legal details, but because of the quiet strength of the woman on the bench and the billionaire who thought his money made him untouchable. As the judge excused herself to chambers, she walked out the same way she'd come in, calm, composed, unhurried. But this time when the bailiff said, "All rise," even the janitor in the back stood up straighter. And Thorne? He stayed seated, but for the first time that morning he didn't look so sure about it. The break lasted only 15 minutes, but it felt like hours to everyone in the courtroom. Outside, the hallway buzzed with hushed conversations. Reporters huddled near the water fountain, phones pressed to their ears, whispering updates to editors. Lawyers from other cases lingered nearby, pretending to review files while stealing glances at the door to courtroom 3B. Even the courthouse cafeteria staff had slowed down, swapping stories about the billionaire who wouldn't stand. Inside, the air still hummed with tension. Thorne's legal team was in full damage control mode. One of his senior attorneys, a woman with perfectly coiffed hair and a voice like polished steel, leaned in close, speaking in low, urgent tones. "You can't keep doing this," she said, glancing toward the bench. "She's not some rookie. She's got the whole bar watching." Thorne just waved her off. "Relax, she's bluffing. Judges don't lock up guys like me over standing up. It's theater, and I've already played my part." But his fingers tapped restlessly against the arm of the chair, betraying the confidence in his voice. He'd faced judges before, plenty of them. Most had been older men, the kind who nodded politely when he walked in, eager to be seen with a billionaire in their courtroom. They'd treated him like a guest, not a litigant. But this was different. This judge didn't smile, didn't flatter, didn't seem impressed at all. Back in her chambers, the judge sat at her desk, sipping black coffee from a plain white mug. Her robe was still on, but she'd unbuttoned the top button of her blouse. On her desk lay Thorne's file, thick, dog-eared, filled with notes in her neat handwriting. She'd read it twice already, not just the legal arguments, but the man behind them. She knew his reputation, knew how he'd built his empire by ignoring rules others followed. Knew about the lawsuits he'd settled quietly, employees who claimed they were passed over for promotions, vendors who said they were strong-armed into unfair contracts, even a former business partner who accused him of stealing an idea and then cutting him out completely. None of it had ever stuck in court. Money had a way of smoothing things over. But she also knew something else. People like him often tested boundaries early, just to see how much they could get away with. And today, he'd chosen to test hers. She wasn't surprised. In fact, part of her had expected it. Ever since her appointment, she'd heard the whispers, the ones that said a woman like her didn't belong on the bench, especially not in a high-stakes commercial court. That she'd only gotten the seat because of diversity goals, that she wouldn't last a year. She'd heard it all before, long before the robe, back when she was just another young lawyer fighting for a seat at the table. But she'd learned early that dignity wasn't something you asked for. It was something you carried, and if someone refused to see it, that was their failure, not hers. Still, she couldn't ignore what had happened. Courtroom decorum wasn't just about tradition. It was about order, about reminding everyone, rich or poor, famous or forgotten, that in that room the law was the only thing that mattered. When someone like Thorne flouted that, it wasn't just disrespectful to her. It undermined the entire system. She set her mug down and stood. Time to go back. When she re-entered the courtroom, the same hush fell over the room. This time, though, more eyes were on Thorne than on her. He sensed it. His smirk was gone. He sat up straighter but still didn't rise. The bailiff called, "All rise," and everyone stood. Again, everyone except him. This time, the judge didn't pause. She walked directly to the bench, sat, and looked out at the room. Then, without looking at Thorne, she said, "Before we resume arguments, I'd like to address the matter of courtroom conduct." A few people shifted in their seats. The court reporter's fingers hovered over the keys. "Respect for the court," she continued, her voice steady, "is not optional. It is not a suggestion. It is a requirement. When an officer of the court calls for all to rise, it is not a performance. It is a recognition that this institution exists to serve justice, not power, not wealth, not ego." She finally turned her gaze to Thorne. "Mr. Thorne, you have twice now refused to stand when this court entered. I gave you the benefit of the doubt earlier. I assumed it might be a misunderstanding, but now it appears to be intentional." He opened his mouth to speak, but she held up a hand just slightly, just enough to stop him without being rude. "I'm not asking you to stand because of me," she said. "I'm asking you to stand because this courtroom belongs to the people of this state. And everyone who walks through that door, whether they're representing a billion-dollar company or fighting an eviction notice, owes it the same basic respect." For a moment, no one moved. Even the clock on the wall seemed to tick louder. Then Thorne leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "With all due respect, Your Honor," he said, his voice lower now, less smug, "I've stood for presidents. I've stood for generals, but I don't stand for symbols. If you want my respect, earn it through your rulings, not your robe." A few of his lawyers winced. Others looked away. It was a bold thing to say, maybe too bold, but the judge didn't flinch. She simply nodded as if she'd heard it all before, which, in a way, she had. "Mr. Thorne," she said, "you seem to misunderstand what this robe represents. It's not a costume. It's a promise that I will treat every person who comes before me with fairness, with patience, and with the full weight of the law behind me."
"That promise doesn't depend on whether you like me."
"It doesn't depend on your opinion of me. It depends only on my duty." She paused, letting the words settle. "And your duty," she added gently but firmly, "is to follow the rules of this court. Not because I demand it, because the law requires it." He didn't respond right away. He just stared at her, his expression unreadable. For the first time, he looked less like a man in control and more like someone realizing he might have miscalculated. The judge turned to the clerk. "Please note for the record that Mr. Thorne has again declined to stand upon the court's entrance, and has stated on the record that he does not recognize the authority of courtroom customs." Then, without missing a beat, she said, "Now, let's return to the motion to dismiss." The attorneys exchanged glances. The defense lawyer, who'd been quiet until now, cleared her throat. "Your Honor, if I may, given the tension, perhaps we could request a short recess to allow all parties to refocus." It was a diplomatic way of saying, "This is getting out of hand." But the judge shook her head slightly. We will proceed. The law doesn't pause because someone is uncomfortable, and so the hearing continued. Arguments were made. Precedents were cited. Objections were raised and overruled. But beneath the legal jargon, something deeper was happening. The room had changed. People sat up straighter. Voices were quieter. Even Thorne's team spoke with more care, as if suddenly aware that every word mattered more than usual. At one point, the judge asked a question about a clause in the contract at the heart of the case. Thorne's lead attorney started to answer but stumbled over a detail. Before he could recover, Thorne interrupted, loudly. It's paragraph 12B, not 12A. How hard is it to read? He snapped. The attorney froze. The judge's eyes narrowed. Mr. Thorne, she said, her voice calm but sharp, you are not counsel in this matter. You will not address the court unless spoken to, and you will not speak over your attorney. He opened his mouth again, then closed it. For the first time, he looked unsure. Later, during a lull in testimony, the judge excused herself briefly to confer with her law clerk. As she stepped into the small anteroom behind the bench, she took a slow breath. Her hands weren't shaking, but her heart was beating faster than usual. Not from fear. From focus. She knew this moment mattered. Not just for her, but for every young lawyer who'd been told they didn't look like a judge. For every person who'd walked into a courtroom and felt invisible. When she returned, she didn't look at Thorne right away. Instead, she addressed the entire room. This court is a place of order, of reason, of equal treatment under the law. If anyone here believes they are above that, because of their bank account, their title, or their opinion of me, they are mistaken. Then she looked directly at him. You don't have to like me, Mr. Thorne, but you will respect this court, or there will be consequences. The words hung in the air like smoke after a match is blown out, visible, lingering, impossible to ignore. Thorne didn't say anything. He just sat back in his chair, his arms no longer crossed, his expression unreadable. But something had shifted. The arrogance was still there, but now it was mixed with something else. Uncertainty, maybe even a flicker of doubt. Outside the courtroom, the world kept turning. But inside, a quiet battle was being fought, not with shouts or threats, but with presence, with principle, with the simple, unshakable belief that dignity doesn't need permission to exist. And as the afternoon wore on, it became clear to everyone watching, this wasn't just about standing up. It was about who gets to be seen, who gets to be heard, and who in the end holds the real power in a room where justice is supposed to be blind, but too often isn't. The judge knew the hearing wasn't over. There would be more arguments, more motions, maybe even an appeal, but she also knew this, she'd drawn a line. And now everyone in that room, especially the man who thought he could ignore, would have to decide which side they stood on, even if they refused to stand at all. The afternoon sun slanted through the high windows of courtroom 3B, casting long shadows across the wooden benches and turning the dust in the air into tiny floating sparks. The legal arguments had gone on for hours, dense, technical, full of references to contracts, clauses, and corporate bylaws that would make most people's eyes glaze over. But no one in that room was bored. Not anymore, because beneath the dry language of the law, something far more human was unfolding. Thorne had grown quieter as the hearing wore on. He still sat with that same stiff posture, but the smirk was long gone. Every time the judge asked a question, even a simple one about dates or signatures, he watched her like a hawk, as if trying to decode her next move. His lawyers, sensing the shift, kept their answers precise, their tones respectful. They'd stopped making eye contact with him during breaks. It was clear. They were done letting him steer the ship. Still, the tension hadn't broken. It had just settled deeper, like a stone sinking in water. Then came the moment the defense had just finished presenting a key piece of evidence. Series of internal emails that suggested Thorne's company had knowingly misled its business partner about the capabilities of their software. The judge reviewed the documents carefully, her expression unreadable. When she looked up, she didn't address the attorneys. She looked straight at Thorne. Mr. Thorne, she said, you were copied on these emails. Did you read them at the time? He hesitated. Just a second, but in a courtroom, a second is an eternity. I skimmed them, he said finally. I don't micromanage every message my team sends. But you signed the final agreement, she said. the one that guaranteed performance levels your software couldn't deliver. I trusted my people, he replied, a little too quickly. Trust is important, the judge said. But so is accountability. When you put your name on a contract, you're not just signing a piece of paper. You're making a promise. To the other party, to the court, and to the public that watches how business is done in this state. He shifted in his seat. With all due respect, Your Honor, business isn't perfect. Mistakes happen. Mistakes, she said gently, are different from misrepresentations. And this court exists to tell the difference. A murmur ran through the gallery. Even the bailiff stood a little straighter. Then, without warning, the judge stood. Everyone rose instantly, except Thorne. He stayed seated, but this time it wasn't out of defiance. It was out of surprise. He looked up at her, confused. She didn't look down at him. Instead, she turned to the clerk. Please call the next matter on the docket. There was a pause. The clerk blinked. Your Honor, we're still in the middle of Thorne Industries versus Metro Data Systems. I'm aware, the judge said calmly. But we will pause this hearing. Mr. Thorne, please approach the bench. The room went still. Thorne stood slowly, brushing invisible lint from his suit. He walked to the front, his shoes clicking against the floor like a countdown. When he reached the bench, the judge leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice so only he and the court reporter could hear. You've been given multiple opportunities to show basic respect for this court, she said. You've declined each time. You've interrupted proceedings. You've dismissed courtroom customs as theater. And now, you sit through a hearing about honesty in business while refusing to honor the very institution designed to uphold it. He opened his mouth to speak. But she held up a finger, just one, and he stopped. This isn't about ego, she continued. It's about order. And right now your behavior is disrupting that order, so I'm giving you one clear choice. You will stand when this court enters, you will address the bench with respect, and you will follow the rules like every other person who walks through that door. Or you will be held in contempt, he stared at her. You wouldn't. I already have, she said. And just like that, she turned to the bailiff. Mr. Thorne is in direct contempt of court for repeated refusal to comply with courtroom protocol and for disrupting judicial proceedings. He is fined $1,000 and will be held in custody until he either complies fully or posts bond for release. The words landed like a hammer. For a second, no one moved. Then the bailiff stepped forward. Sir, please come with me. Thorne's face went pale. This is insane. Do you know who I am? I know exactly who you are, the judge said, her voice steady. And right now you're a litigant in contempt of court. That's all that matters here. His legal team erupted. Your Honor, please, this is unprecedented. We request an immediate stay. The request is denied, she said. The law applies equally. Two bailiffs moved toward Thorne. He stepped back, shaking his head. You can't do this. I have meetings. Then you should have stood up when asked, the judge said simply. He looked around the room as if expecting someone to intervene. But no one did. His own lawyers were frozen, caught between loyalty and shock. The reporters were scribbling furiously. Even the security camera in the corner seemed to be watching. Finally, with a stiff nod, he turned and walked toward the side door with the bailiffs. But just before he disappeared, he turned back. This isn't over, he said, his voice low but sharp. The judge met his gaze without flinching. It's over when justice is served, not when you say it is. The door closed behind him. Silence. Then a slow exhale from the defense attorney. A few people in the gallery let out breaths they didn't realize they'd been holding. Someone whispered, Did that really just happen? The judge sat back down. She smoothed her robe, took a sip of water, and looked out at the room. Her expression wasn't triumphant. It wasn't angry, it was resolved. Counsel, she said to the defense team, we'll reconvene this matter in 48 hours pending Mr. Thorne's compliance or formal appeal of the contempt ruling. Until then, the court is adjourned, she rose. This time everyone stood, quickly, automatically, as if reminded of something they'd forgotten. As she walked out, the weight of what had just happened settled over the room like fog. A billionaire, used to private jets, five-star hotels, and people jumping at his command, had just been escorted out of a courtroom in handcuffs. Well, not literal handcuffs, but the message was the same, for refusing to stand up. But it wasn't really about standing. It was about who gets to set the rules. For years, people like him had operated in a world where money smoothed every bump, where apologies were optional, and where respect was something you bought, not earned. But here, in this ordinary courtroom with its scuffed floors and flickering fluorescent lights, none of that mattered. Here, the only currency was fairness, and the judge had just reminded everyone what that looked like. Outside, the news vans were already pulling up. Reporters sprinted up the courthouse steps, phones in hand. Social media lit up with clips, grainy, shaky, but unmistakable. The moment the bailiffs led him away, the calm authority in the judge's voice, the stunned silence that followed. But inside the courthouse, something quieter was happening. A young law clerk, barely out of school, stood in the hallway with tears in her eyes. She'd grown up in a neighborhood where people said courts weren't built for folks like her. She'd worked 3 jobs to get through law school, always wondering if she'd ever see someone who looked like her on the bench. Someone who didn't bend, didn't apologize for existing, and didn't back down. Now she had, in another corner, an older attorney, one who'd been practicing for 40 years, shook his head and muttered to a colleague, "I've seen judges lose their cool. I've seen them play favorites. But I've never seen one hold the line like that." Without raising her voice once, even the janitor pushing his cart down the hall paused outside the courtroom door. He'd heard the commotion. He'd seen the billionaire storm out. And he'd watched the judge walk away with her head high, like she'd just done the most ordinary thing in the world, because to her, it was. Back in her chambers, the judge removed her robe and hung it carefully on the back of the door. She sat at her desk, staring out the window at the Atlanta skyline. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was even. But inside she felt the weight of it all, the eyes on her, the expectations, the fear that someone would call her angry or too strict just for doing her job. She thought about the calls she'd get tonight, the emails, the messages from people who'd say she'd gone too far, and the ones from people who'd say thank you. Finally, she didn't need either. She just needed to sleep well, knowing she hadn't let the robe down. Meanwhile, downtown, Thorne sat in a holding room at the county detention center. Not a cell, not jail, just a secure waiting area for those held on civil contempt. No phone, no assistant, no escape. Just 4 walls and the echo of his own choices. He paced for a while. Then he sat. Then he stared at the floor. For the first time in years, he was alone with the consequences of his actions, and no amount of money could change that. Back in the courtroom, the chairs were empty, the files stacked neatly, the gavel resting on the bench. But the air still hummed with what had happened there. Because something had shifted. Not just in that room, but in the way people saw power, respect, and who gets to wear the robe. And the most shocking part wasn't that a billionaire had been held in contempt. It was that a black woman in a black robe had done it, calmly, fairly, and without apology. And the courtroom hadn't just accepted it, it had respected it. By the next morning, the story had spread like wildfire. It wasn't just on the local news anymore. It was everywhere. National headlines, morning talk shows, late-night monologues, and every social media feed from coast to coast carried some version of the same clip. A billionaire being escorted out of a courtroom after refusing to stand for a judge. And that judge, calm, composed, unwavering, issuing a contempt order without raising her voice. But what surprised everyone wasn't just the drama. It was the reaction. People weren't just talking about the spectacle. They were talking about her, about what it meant to see a black woman in a robe hold her ground against someone who thought his money made him untouchable. Strangers posted photos of their daughters wearing homemade future judge badges. Law schools shared clips in orientation emails. Even retired judges, some who'd served for decades, wrote op-eds saying, "This is how the bench should look, firm, fair, and fearless." Yet not all the attention was kind. Within hours, the usual voices appeared online, people calling her power-hungry, disrespectful to business leaders, or worse. But for every cruel comment, 10 more poured in from teachers, nurses, bus drivers, single parents, ordinary people who said, "She made me feel seen." Still, the judge didn't check her phone. She didn't scroll through headlines. She arrived at the courthouse at 7:15 a.m., same as always. With a thermos of coffee and a stack of case files under her arm, she walked past the news vans parked outside. ignored the shouted questions from reporters, and went straight to her chambers. She had a full docket today: custody disputes, small claims, a landlord-tenant case involving a family of 6. None of it involved billionaires. All of it mattered just as much. Meanwhile, downtown, things were unraveling for the man who'd thought he was above it all. Overnight, his legal team had scrambled. They'd filed an emergency motion to overturn the contempt ruling, but the appeals court, surprisingly, denied it within hours, citing the judge's clear authority and Thorne's repeated refusal to comply. Bond was set at $5,000, which he could have paid with pocket change, but that wasn't the point. The point was the humiliation. The image. The fact that for the first time in his life, he wasn't in control. And then came the real blow. It started with a single post on an internal company message board, a former employee sharing a screenshot of an old email where Thorne had written, "We don't need diversity hires slowing us down." Then another former staffer came forward, describing how he'd mocked a female executive during a meeting, saying, "Smile more, you'll get further." Then another, and another. Within 24 hours, a pattern emerged, not just of arrogance, but of behavior that many had quietly endured for years, afraid to speak up because of his power, his influence, his ability to ruin careers with a single phone call. Now, with the courtroom video going viral, people weren't afraid anymore. Major news outlets began digging. They found old lawsuits, some settled quietly, others buried in county records, that painted a troubling picture. Vendors pressured into unfair deals. Junior employees passed over for promotions despite strong performance reviews. Even a whistleblower who'd been forced out after raising concerns about data privacy violations. One reporter tracked down a former intern who'd worked in his office 5 years ago. She spoke on background, voice trembling but clear. He'd walk past black employees like they weren't there. But if a white investor came in, he'd drop everything. Offer them his chair, remember their kids' names. It wasn't subtle. It was just normal for him. The story was no longer about courtroom etiquette. It was about who gets treated like a person and who gets treated like furniture. His company's stock dipped. Not dramatically, but enough to make headlines. His board held an emergency meeting. Sponsors for his upcoming tech conference started pulling out. Even his favorite charity, the one he'd used for photo ops at galas, quietly removed his name from their donor wall. Back in the courthouse, the judge heard none of this directly. But she didn't need to. She saw it in the eyes of the bailiff, who gave her a small, proud nod as she passed. She saw it in the way the court reporter held her head a little higher. She saw it in the young law student who lingered after a hearing just to say, "Thank you for showing us what integrity looks like." Still, she stayed focused. She ruled on a case involving a grandmother trying to keep her home from foreclosure. She listened patiently as a teenager explained why he missed his traffic court date. His bus broke down, and he couldn't afford an Uber. She asked thoughtful questions, cited the right statutes, and never once let the noise outside distract her from the people right in front of her. But the world outside kept turning and talking. On Friday morning, something unexpected happened. A group of employees from Thorne's own company showed up at the courthouse, not to protest, but to support. They wore matching T-shirts that read, "Respect is earned," and stood quietly on the steps, holding signs that said, "We stand with justice," and "Dignity has no price." They didn't chant. They didn't block entrances. They just stood there in silence as a statement. One of them, a woman in her 30s with tired eyes and a firm jaw, spoke briefly to a reporter. "We've watched him treat people like they don't matter for years. Today, someone finally said, they do, and that matters to us." Inside, the judge heard about it during lunch. Her clerk brought her a sandwich and said softly, "You should see the steps, Your Honor." She didn't go out, but she smiled just a little and said, "Tell them thank you, and tell them justice isn't mine. It belongs to all of us." That afternoon, Thorne's legal team requested an emergency hearing, not to fight the contempt charge, to apologize. The judge agreed, but only if Thorne appeared in person. He did. He arrived early without his usual entourage. No designer suit, just a simple dark blazer and slacks. He stood at the courthouse entrance for a full minute before walking in, as if steeling himself. When he entered courtroom 3B, the bailiff called, "All rise." This time he stood immediately. He didn't look smug, didn't look bored. He looked human, tired even. The judge entered a few minutes later. Again, the bailiff called for everyone to rise. Again, Thorne stood quickly without hesitation. She took her seat, looked at him, waited. His attorney stepped forward. Your Honor, Mr. Thorne requests permission to address the court directly. Granted, she said. Thorne walked to the well of the courtroom. He didn't approach the bench this time. He stood where all litigants stand, equal, exposed, accountable. He took a breath. Your Honor, he began, his voice quieter than anyone had ever heard it. I owe you and this court an apology. He paused, swallowed. I came in here thinking the rules didn't apply to me, that my success gave me a pass. That standing was just a formality, not a sign of respect. I was wrong. A few people in the gallery shifted. No one spoke. I've spent my life building things, he continued, but I forgot that institutions like this one, the ones that protect the little guy, that hold even the powerful accountable, are the real foundation of everything we have. And by refusing to honor that, I disrespected not just you, but everyone who relies on this system to be fair. He looked down for a moment, then back up. I don't expect forgiveness, but I do want to make it right. I'll pay the fine. I'll comply with every rule, and I'll do better. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the clock ticking. The judge studied him. Not with suspicion, not with pity, just with the same steady gaze she gave everyone. Apologies mean little without action, she said finally, but I accept your statement. The fine stands. The contempt order remains on the record, not as punishment but as a reminder that no one is above the law. He nodded. Understood. Court will reconvene your case Monday morning, she added. Be on time, and be respectful. I will, Your Honor. As he turned to leave, something small but significant happened. He didn't stride out like he owned the place. He walked slowly, and as he passed the defense table, he gave a slight nod, not to the lawyers but to the opposing counsel, the woman who'd been fighting his company for months. It wasn't much, but it was something. After he left, the judge turned to her next case, a dispute over a damaged fence between neighbors. She handled it with the same care, the same patience, as if nothing extraordinary had just occurred. But everyone knew it had, because what had started as a moment of disrespect had become something bigger, a reckoning, a reflection, and maybe, just maybe, a turning point. Not because a billionaire was humbled, but because a judge, doing her job with quiet strength, reminded everyone that justice isn't about who you are. It's about what you do when no one's watching, and what you do when everyone is. Monday morning arrived with a different kind of quiet. The news vans were still parked outside the courthouse, but fewer now. Most had moved on to the next big story. The buzz on social media had softened from a roar to a hum. Yet inside courtroom 3B, the air still carried the weight of what had happened, like the room itself remembered. Thorne walked in 10 minutes early. He wore a simple charcoal suit, no flashy watch, no entourage. When he entered, he didn't scan the room for cameras or reporters. He went straight to his seat, sat down, and waited. When the bailiff called, "All rise," he stood before the words were even finished. The judge entered a few minutes later. She looked the same as always, composed, focused, her robe crisp, her steps measured. But something had shifted in the way people looked at her. Not with awe, not with fear, but with a quiet kind of trust. Like they finally understood this wasn't about power. It was about principle. She took her seat, looked out at the room, then nodded to the clerk. Please call the matter of Thorne Industries versus Metro Data Systems. The hearing resumed where it left off, but the tone was entirely different. Thorne's legal team presented their arguments with precision, not arrogance. The opposing counsel spoke firmly but fairly. Even Thorne, seated quietly at the table, listened without interrupting, something his own attorneys seemed genuinely surprised by. At one point, the judge asked a question about a disputed clause in the contract. Thorne's lead attorney started to answer, then paused and turned to his client. Mr. Thorne, you were present during those negotiations. Would you like to clarify? For a moment, everyone held their breath. Would he take over again? Would he make it about himself? He didn't. He simply said, "I'll defer to counsel, Your Honor," and sat back. The judge gave a small nod. Not approval, just acknowledgement. And the hearing continued. By mid-afternoon, both sides had rested. The judge didn't rule from the bench. She said she'd review the filings and issue a written decision within the week. But before adjourning, she addressed the room one last time. This case, she said, is about more than software or contracts. It's about honesty, about accountability, and about the understanding that when you enter into an agreement, whether with a giant corporation or a single employee, you carry a responsibility to uphold it. She looked at Thorne, not with judgment but with expectation. We'll see in the ruling whether that responsibility was met. But regardless of the outcome, I hope all parties leave this courtroom with a deeper respect for the process and for each other. Then she rose. Everyone stood. This time, Thorne didn't wait for the bailiff. He was already on his feet. As he walked out, a reporter approached him on the courthouse steps. "Any comments, sir?" He stopped, thought for a second, then said, "I came here thinking I knew how the world worked. Turns out I had a lot to learn." And with that, he got into a plain black sedan, no tinted windows, no security detail, and drove away. The judge's ruling came 3 days later. It was thorough, fair, and unflinching. She found that Thorne's company had indeed misrepresented key features of their software, violating the terms of the contract. She ordered them to pay full damages, over $2 million, and cover the opposing party's legal fees. But she also noted that Thorne had shown a meaningful shift in courtroom conduct and a willingness to engage with the judicial process in good faith. It wasn't praise. It was observation. And in legal terms, that was rare. The business world took notice. Some called the ruling a warning shot to other CEOs who thought they could treat courts like boardrooms. Others saw it as proof that accountability could coexist with redemption. But the real story wasn't in the ruling. It was in what happened next. 6 weeks later, a quiet announcement appeared on the website of a local law school. A new scholarship had been established for first-generation law students from underrepresented backgrounds. The donor, Thorne Industries. The name of the fund? The Evelyn Carter Justice Fellowship. No press release, no gala. Just a simple statement. To support those who believe fairness isn't a privilege, it's a promise. Around the same time, the judge received a letter. Not through official channels. Just a plain envelope hand-delivered to the courthouse clerk. Inside was a single page typed unsigned. It read, "You didn't just hold me accountable. You reminded me what respect really means. Thank you for not giving up on the idea that people can change." She read it once, folded it carefully, and placed it in the bottom drawer of her desk, next to her bar admission certificate and a photo of her grandmother, who'd worked as a seamstress and always told her, "Stand tall, even when they try to make you small." Life in the courthouse returned to its usual rhythm. Custody hearings, traffic violations, contract disputes, each one handled with the same care, the same attention. But something had changed in the air. Lawyers were more courteous. Litigants listened more closely. Even the way people stood when the judge entered felt different, not out of fear but out of shared understanding. One afternoon, a young woman came to observe court as part of a high school civics program. After the session, she lingered near the bench, too shy to speak. The judge noticed and waved her over. "Yes, dear?" she asked gently. The girl swallowed. I want to be a judge one day." The judge smiled. "Then start now. Stand for what's right. Listen more than you speak. And never let anyone tell you you don't belong." The girl nodded, eyes bright. "Did you ever doubt yourself?" "Every day," the judge admitted. "But I kept showing up. And that's what matters." That moment, small, human, real, was never filmed, never posted online. But it echoed louder than any viral clip. As the months passed, the story became less about a billionaire's fall and more about a quiet kind of courage. The kind that doesn't shout, doesn't seek attention, but simply does what's right day after day, case after case. Thorne never returned to that courtroom, but his company implemented new ethics training. He began sitting in on diversity panels, not as a speaker, but as a listener. And when a junior employee raised concerns about workplace culture, he didn't dismiss her. He met with her personally. Back in courtroom 3B, the judge continued her work. She never mentioned the incident again, never used it as a lesson or a warning. She just presided, with fairness, with patience, with the kind of dignity that doesn't need to announce itself. Because real power isn't in wealth. It isn't in titles. It's in the choice to do the right thing, even when no one's watching and especially when everyone is. Years later, long after the headlines faded, people would still talk about that day. Not because a billionaire was held in contempt, but because a judge wearing a simple black robe reminded everyone that justice isn't a performance, it's a promise. And in that ordinary courtroom, on an ordinary Monday morning, that promise was kept. Not with drama, not with anger, but with calm, unwavering resolve. The kind that changes more than just a courtroom. It changes the world, one quiet act of courage at a time.